Hey, Bio 2870 students. This is Dr. Martin Crozier. Just want to do a quick introduction to Chapter 1, and we'll look at Chapter 1.1 in this video. This is an introductory chapter to the field of anatomy and physiology, and so there are some things here that are very basic in regards to biology in general. And so I may skim through these very quickly, just touching on a couple key points. I would assume that you would have read the chapter in its entirety, but I want to focus on a couple things that I think are worth highlighting, so that you're sure to understand those concepts at the very least. So this chapter has 8 sections, 1.1 through 1.8, and we'll look at 1.1. So biology is a broad field of scientific study. It's a scientific study of life. Of course, in biology, biologists are concerned with what are the characteristics that are true of all living things. That is to say, if X is a living thing, then X has this feature. And so this textbook highlights 4 or 5 that I think are pretty well received as being true of all living things, although I will point out a couple exceptions that may come up. So one aim is to discover patterns underlying the diversity among these living things. Of course, there is a lot of diversity in the domains of life. 3 broad domains, those things that are archaeans, those things that are bacteria, and those things that are eukaryotic. And because of our concern in human anatomy and physiology, we fall under the domain of eukaryotic organisms. The domain eukarya has 4 kingdoms, namely protists, fungi, plants, and animals. And of course, human beings fall under the kingdom Animalia, as we are vertebrates under the group of Chordata, phylum Chordata. And so we are one of 36 phyla, or families or groups of animals in the domain eukarya. But all living things, whether it's a bacterium or an archaean or a protist or a fungus or a plant or an animal, all living things share several things in common. They've listed 5 here. I've seen some textbooks list as many as 7 or 8 or 9 features that are true of all living things. But very, very briefly, just read these. There's a paragraph given on the next slides to each of these: responsiveness, growth, reproduction, movement, metabolism, and so on. Responsiveness, quite simply, is the fact that living things respond to their local environment. Sometimes this is called irritability. That gives the idea of someone being annoyed, perhaps, which is a form of responsiveness to perhaps social cues. But this is really referring to mechanical or chemical, physical or electrical stimuli, solar light stimuli, for example, responding to a bright light or something blinking or closing your eyes. Those are all examples of irritability or responsiveness, moving away from a painful stimulus, and so on. Now, living things also can respond to their environment over long term. And typically this is controlled by chemicals like hormones in the body. This we refer to adaptability. That is, for example, an organism changing its coat color as the seasons change to perhaps become more camouflaged with the snow in their environment, for example. Or, as they put here, an example of growing a heavier coat for fur in winter. That's an example of a subset of responsiveness called adaptability. All living things grow, but when we say growth, we can mean one of 2 things. Sometimes we just mean increasing size, and that can be accomplished in one of 2 ways. For an organism that consists of only one cell, that cell simply gets larger. That would be growth. That can happen also in multicellular organisms like human beings. We consist of trillions and trillions of cells, and those cells can grow. That is, they can increase in size. But we can also refer to growth, or growth can also occur through cell proliferation, that is, cell division. So addition of new cells. As cells divide and you have more cells, and those cells then grow in size, the organism as a whole gets larger and larger. Now, most cells in multicellular organisms will move down a certain lineage pathway and become more and more specialized. We refer to this as cell differentiation, or cell specialization, or sometimes cell maturation. So even though we all start off as a single cell, that single cell is able to produce over 200 different cell types, which belong to 4 main tissues in humans: nervous tissue, muscle tissue, connective tissue, and epithelial tissue. We'll talk more about those in Chapter 4, and we'll see those throughout the semester. But once a cell differentiates down one of those lineages, it cannot really become a cell type of a different lineage, and it will remain that cell type throughout its life without any type of molecular intervention, say by a scientist in a laboratory. Reproduction. Most textbooks say that reproduction is characteristic of all living things, although I can think of some exceptions. For example, some species, hybrid species, for example, mating of a horse and a donkey can produce a mule and or hiney, depending on the sex of the horse and the donkey that are involved. But these organisms are by and large sterile. They can't produce viable offspring. Nevertheless, we wouldn't want to say that a mule is not a living organism simply because it is by and large sterile. There are some individuals within that species that can reproduce. And of course, even within other species like humans, there could be individuals who are sterile, but of course we would want to say that they are, in fact, living. Living things move. We can refer to movement here as moving of the body or even movement within a body. So internal or external, transporting fluids through vascular tissue, for example, whether it's in a plant or an animal, or gases. And of course, movement of the body. Now, many things that are living, trees, for example, while they can bend and sway, the organism does not move. It is sessile. And even some animals like sponges are sessile. Nevertheless, we want to say they're living. So I put a little asterisk beside these characteristics just to make sure we're clear. This is by and large true of most living things. And of course, all living things use energy and spend energy. And overall, we refer to this category as metabolism. It's a sum of all chemical reactions or operations that take place in a cell or in all of the cells of an organism. And those chemical organisms can be broken down and release energy that's found in the chemical bonds that hold those molecules together. Or our bodies can actually take the subunits and build more complex things. So metabolism is a sum of, it's both the building and the breaking down of chemicals. The building of complex molecules from simpler ones requires the input of energy. And we refer to these reactions as anabolic reactions. And those reactions that break down complex things into simpler parts we call catabolic reactions. So anabolism plus catabolism, the building and the breaking down of complex molecules, are all the chemical reactions that take place in our body, are collectively metabolism. These require the building blocks to break down. They require gases as fuel to burn and consume these, and they produce waste products that have to be eliminated from the body. So metabolic processes involve respiration, the absorption or ingestion and transport of fuel and of subunits, the breaking down of those complex molecules, whether through mechanical and or chemical digestion. We'll talk about more of that in the final unit of this course, in the digestive system. And of course, the production of waste products that need to be removed from the body excretion.